bringing you live history in our live stream lecture for this weekend, this extended weekend here in the United States. It's MLK Day, and I will be discussing the life, legacy, and impact of one of history's greatest people, Martin Luther King Jr., and I will also be discussing the English Civil War. We were unable to do our live stream lecture yesterday. A lot going on. Obviously, a lot of issues regarding to relocating that can come up very suddenly and kind of jump on you, and so you aren't always able to do exactly what you wanted. But for the first time ever, we are going live on a non-weekday, on a non-weekend, at least if you consider those of you who are working on a Monday, obviously. But we are, yes, now I'm available. But basically, we are here for the next hour or so doing Friendly Neighborhoods history stuff. And we will be talking about a couple of, and happy MLK Day to you as well. We will be talking about important historical events related to, obviously, the life of Martin Luther King, as well as the English Civil War. And that's what we do here at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. We meant to do for, wow, I'm glad it's snowed in. I'm glad you're here to join us. Great to see you. We do our weekend Q&As Friday and Saturday evenings where you can ask me anything about history or social studies, and I will answer whatever questions you may have. And it is now, and I will be discussing the English Civil War on this live stream lecture, as well as MLK Day. We do our live stream lectures usually on Sundays. We were supposed to do one on Sunday and today, so we were going to do 4 live streams back to back to back to back, but we were unable to do yesterday's successfully. So instead, we are doing one today to make up for it. So I'm going to try to do both of those topics, and we'll see how long it takes us. Martin Luther King Jr., his life and legacy, and the English Civil War. And I'll be going in chronological order, so I'll be talking about the English Civil War first off. So if you're an Anglophile, the first part's for you, but hopefully you learned something from this live stream and you really enjoy it. Consider liking and subscribing. And if you hear any background noise, it's people moving around and talking about, obviously, the thing I did wanted to speak about a couple of minutes at the beginning of the live stream, and that is the inauguration of President Donald Trump. Trump is now officially the 47th president of the United States. At noon today, he took over, gave an inaugural address that was actually pretty good, surprising a lot of people who don't believe that Trump can ever show any signs of refinement or polish. And it was an interesting speech, and as a historian, I found it interesting. There were some inaccuracies there that as a historian, I kind of rolled my eyes over. But at the same time, I was also... Hold on one second. Anyways, so sorry about that. But basically, yes, so I'm talking about I'll be talking about the English Civil War in the live stream lecture, and I'll be talking about the MLK and his life and legacy and all of this great stuff. And if you like the Smoking Jacket, if you like learning about history, you're in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing and joining the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, becoming a subscriber here. There's also Patreon, social media handles that are similar to Friendly Neighborhood History, something around those. So hey, great to see everybody. I won't be interacting with the chat as much as I usually do with the live stream Q&As that we do every Friday and Saturday night, but hopefully you enjoy learning about history, because if you enjoy learning about social studies, social sciences, the past, and how the past informs the present and sets us up for the future, then you are in the right place, and I welcome you. Thank you for joining us at the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Yes, I have not seen Scream. I'm good. I hope you're good as well. I'm so glad to see you. Grab something to drink. I have my cold coffee once again, and it's great to see everybody joining us as well. I wanted to give a couple of comments about Trump's inauguration. The speech was surprisingly refreshing. There was a lot of demagoguery in it, which Trump promised a lot of things that it'll be difficult to see if he can actually deliver on them in the next 4 years or so, but that's his goal. If he does, he'll be one of the most accomplished presidents in U.S. history. It was also full of a continuation of Trump's rhetoric about America first and all of that. That's how he started off a speech. It was clearly well celebrated and well welcomed by Democrats and hated by Republicans and hated by the Democrats. But overall, as a historian, as somebody who has read and listened to a lot of speeches from a lot of presidents, and that's part of my job as a historian, I have to say it was a pretty good speech. And for Trump, it was exceptionally good, better than his first inaugural address. And I gave a quick video where I ranked it, but it had the polish, it had the promise, it had that vision of what America should look like and what was going to happen and how America should develop and where America should go. And so it was, despite Trump not being always known for being polished or well refined or anything like that, it was actually a well done speech by a U.S. president, and we'll see if he can deliver on what he has actually promised. It's going to be a very interesting 4 years to see how much of that inaugural address actually gets done, and you can go back and look at Biden's inaugural address, which I thought was good, but not as good as this one, and you can see, did that president achieve what they wanted? Did they have that vision going forward? Trump was very specific about it, a lot of his policy demands and things like that. And I think he's going to wield a very strong imperial presidency, similar to Teddy Roosevelt or FDR, in order to get done what he wants to get done. So you're going to see Trump try to improve and increase the power of the executive branch and the presidency during his time, and that's how he's going to get a lot of these things done, especially if he loses control of Congress, with the Republicans losing the majority in the midterms next year. So we'll see what happens there. Of course, history can inform us about what's happening. Interestingly enough, history has rhymed, as it always does. It doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, like Mark Twain said. And right before Trump took office, Israel and Hamas reached a deal which will see the hostages, a lot of them, released, just like when Reagan became president in 1980, despite the efforts of Jimmy Carter. The Iranian hostage crisis ended, and the Iranian hostages were released. So there's a lot of historical parallelism happening. There's a lot of comparisons between Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden, and there's been a lot of comparisons to Reagan and Trump. Trump also had his inauguration due to weather conditions inside of the rotunda of the Capitol, which parallels Reagan in his second inauguration in 1985, doing the exact same thing. Actually, access to Rome, it's supposed to be cold. I like it cold. So anyways, so there's a little bit of stuff about Donald Trump's inauguration. I would say it's a 7 out of 10. He was wrong about some other things he said historically about, for instance, the Panama Canal, but I mean, he's not supposed to be perfect. So anyways, yes, I do speak quickly to get out as much information as possible, but hopefully, thank you. It's technically a smoking jacket. I hope you guys enjoy the smoking jacket. I hope you enjoy what I'm talking about. If you like learning about social studies, social sciences, geopolitics, past and present, then you're in the right spot here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, as I was just discussing the inauguration of Donald Trump and its historical significance and everything. And my wonderful moderator, Rodolfo, is here. Make sure to show him some love. And anyways, so thank you. It's a smoking jacket. Its origins come from the British in the 19th century, who would get Turkish tobacco after the end of the Crimean War, bring it back to Britain, and would make these jackets that they could wear after dinner so they could smoke properly and not get the ash and smell on their clothes. So ergo, the smoking jacket. And Taylor, yes, he is still mod. He is not here today. I think he's at work. But we've got Rodolfo moderating and hopefully holding down the chat and everything. So I'm not going to... Mania, that's what I do. I talk about history and I explain history, and that's what I do because I'm a historian, and this is a history channel. So whether you liked it or not, you just learned some history. Anyways, robe works. Robe, dressing gown. It's like a fancy upscale type of robe. So I'm glad you learned something new. Will I ever smoke my smoking jacket? I have. I did a video for my Patreonies, so if you want to, you can subscribe to my Patreon as well, Friendly History there. And I have a video where I'm smoking and explaining the history of the smoking jacket. And I've smoked a cigar on the channel doing a live stream talking about Winston Churchill because that was appropriate. But anyways, I only smoke once in a great while, and I don't smoke cigarettes because those are just absolutely ridiculous. And Gerald Glass, happy MLK Day to you as well. Yes, this is MLK Day, and you have joined the Friendly Neighborhood Historian or History Channel and our live stream lecture where I'll be talking about the history and the life and the legacy of Dr. King. So now that I've got the inauguration out of the way, I'm going to be talking in chronological order, starting with the English Civil War and how the English got rid of their king for over a decade. Believe it or not, we always think of the British as having a ruler, but for a long time, they actually didn't. And then I will be talking about Dr. King as well. So let me paint a picture for you. 1603, Queen Elizabeth, who has ruled over England for 45 years and has expanded the country's land, wealth, and influence across the entire world, has just died. She is often considered, and arguably I would agree, the greatest English monarch in history. She has ruled for 45 years. No one thought she would be able to do it. No one thought she would be able to succeed. She lived her entire life with this whole question of whether or not she would get married, but she basically was able to retain and sustain her power by not getting married, not bowing to the wishes of her nobles, following the advice of good advisors, and letting the arts and culture and economy of the British flourish. And England has grown in its influence and power. They even have colonies in the New World that they're just starting out in under her flag. So, but basically, so she is succeeded by her son, not her son, because she doesn't have any children, because she's not married, but she's succeeded by the son of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who she actually executed 15 years before this. Mary Queen of Scots was thrown out of power in Scotland and forced to flee to England in the 1570s. Elizabeth had kept her there for a while, but eventually decided, because Catholics continued to have these uprisings to try to put Mary in charge of the English throne, that she couldn't have that with the Reformation still going on. So as a Protestant monarch, Elizabeth decided to save her own skin by making sure Mary, Queen of Scots, would not be a rallying cry for Catholic rebels and having her killed. That was in 1588. 15 years later, Elizabeth dies with no heir, about the age of 70, and she is going to be succeeded, ironically, by Mary's son, James, who took over when Mary fled the country and was forced to flee in 1567, and he took over when he was the ripe old age of 1. And obviously he had a regent, but he was James VI of Scotland and had ruled for 35 years at this point, and now he becomes James I, the King of England. So he is going to become the English monarch, and he is also the Scottish monarch. England and Scotland are two separate countries with their own parliaments and own system of governments, and so it's going to be a very different rule between England and Scotland, yet they're going to be ruled by the same person for the next century, and then they're going to become one country. So James is well known during his reign for feuding with Parliament, and he really thinks that he is above Parliament. He believes that because he is in charge, he is the king, it's because God wants him there, and therefore he can do whatever he wants. This idea is called the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings says that God puts the king or queen there, and therefore you should be grateful that God has done this, and if they are a bad monarch, it is because you are being punished for your sins, and if they are a good monarch, it is because God is blessing you and your society. And that is what King James I really believes. His biggest goal is to standardize religious practice. He persecutes a group of people who hate the Church of England because they think it's too corrupt. They're known as the Pilgrims or the Separatists, and they eventually flee and go to the New World, and that's where the story of the first Thanksgiving comes from. He also decides to standardize Christian worship by embracing the moderate form of Protestantism that his cousin Elizabeth had, and by creating one standard Bible for the entire Church of England. That standard Bible is the authorized version because it was authorized by the government of King James, and in 1611 it is finally published, and it is named after him. The King James Bible, the most famous and well-known translation of the Bible, comes from him. James struggles with popularity and struggles with holding on to the throne because there are Catholics who are plotting against him, such as a man named Guy Fawkes, who leads a group of Catholics and co-conspirators to try to blow up Parliament while the king is there. Remember, the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day. It was a failed coup and assassination attempt of the king and of the government, and Fawkes was, of course, hung for this and everything. But James is going to continue to push this idea that he is above the state and that he can do whatever he wants for the remainder of his reign until he finally dies in 1625. He leaves his ideas of a divine right of kings to his son Charles, who becomes King Charles I of England, and I think it's Charles I of Scotland too. And again, remember, he's ruling over England as one country and Scotland as a second country. And Charles has a lot of ideas for basically running Parliament, and his idea is very simple. He wants to tell Parliament what to do whenever he wants. Basically, Parliament is at his behest and his beck and call, and Parliament never signed on to this, nor do they agree with this. Now, there's a rising group of Puritans in Parliament who have a really strong religious conviction, influenced by Calvinism and Reformed doctrines from the continent, who want England to follow that path. And more they become more irritated by how openly secular Charles I is. Now, he says he's religious, but he doesn't really seem to care that much about his Protestant convictions, and instead really just wants to use his throne as a way to increase his wealth and power while also bullying Parliament. At least that's what the parliamentarians will tell you. So as time goes on, he calls the Parliament, they can't get anything done, they disband. This cycle repeats several times throughout his reign until eventually he decides that Parliament is worthless and he tries to dissolve them permanently. When he tries to dissolve them permanently, they decide that they've had enough of his nonsense and him trying to be a dictator and set himself up, because he believes God is leading him in this direction and they believe God is leading them in that direction. So this civil war, or English Revolution, if you want to call it that, is really a subset of the Protestant Reformation, which obviously called into question not just the authority of the Catholic Church, but the authority of monarchs compared to people who use their individual Bibles to guide them through their religious life, which is what Protestants are. So, anyways, thank you, Danny, by the way. If you're enjoying, and I don't know how high my IQ is, I'm hoping it's high, And yes, remember the 5th of November. And thank you everyone for listening. And I hope if you're enjoying what you're learning about here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, that you will like and subscribe and become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. It's as easy as that. And thank you everybody for being here. I know Mondays are always difficult and busy, so great to see everybody here. And I'm going to keep going with the program. So Charles basically tries to dissolve Parliament, and so Parliament raises an army. And in 1642, a civil war breaks out between two groups, and there are two major groups: the Cavaliers, which support the king, and the Roundheads, which, or I'm trying to remember what they're called, who support the parliamentarians. And that army, and they're going to build up an army that'll take over the southern part of the kingdom, while the northern part of the kingdom and Scotland are going to be loyal to the king. And they're going to fight a series of several battles. At first, the king does very well in defeating them. And of course, his sight is set on capturing London, because if he can capture London, he can imprison and hang all the parliamentarians as treasonous enemies and reestablish his control over the House of Lords. By the way, the English Parliament is divided into two chambers: the House of Lords, which is usually people who have noble blood in them, dukes and earls and barons, and then there is the House of Commons, which is a group of people who are elected representatives of the people, representing the common man. So, what was I going to say next? Anyways, what happens is, at first the king is very successful at defeating the rebels. However, it is a man named Oliver Cromwell who will change the game. He emerges as one of the most religiously zealous of the Puritans, who leads the new army, and he devises not just political strategy for taking down the king, but a military strategy. All of this is inspired by his extreme devotion to Calvinist theology and to Protestant Christianity. He's an extreme Puritan. He's a very, very hardcore Puritan, as are many of the followers who have rebelled against the king in Parliament. And they know their lives are on the line, and the king's life, he doesn't know, is also on the line. So Cromwell establishes and builds up a group called the New Model Army. And the New Model Army, or Flatheads, Flatheads as they're known because of the type of helmets they wear, become extraordinarily effective at defeating the king's armies, which are more ragtag and kind of an assembly of different groups of forces. You have Scottish forces, you have forces from here. You don't have a really well-refined army like Cromwell is able to create with a New Model Army. And in 1646, they successfully capture the king, or 1647, I believe. And then after that, the king is put on trial by Parliament, because the Magna Carta 4 centuries earlier had said the king is not above the law, and since Parliament is part of the execution of the law, they put the king under trial and find him guilty of treason. So because of this, they actually sentence the King of England to death. They take away the throne from him, they strip him of all his noble titles, and they kill him in 1649. And so Charles I ends his life not as a king in a palace dying in a comfy bed, but by being beheaded by his own people. So before the French beheaded their own monarchs, the English had done it first. Meanwhile, Charles' family, mainly led by his son Charles, are forced to escape. Now, Charles was married to the daughter of the King of France, or I believe it was, or the sister. And so Charles's family is allowed to flee to France, and they will try to cause revolutions and insurrections over the next 11 years. But in 1649, Parliament takes over. Now, Parliament continues to have the bureaucratic strictures and laws and blocks that continue to block King Charles I, and this starts to block their ideas for progress, their ideas of economic and political and religious reform. They try to make England as Calvinistic as possible, basically believing in predestination and that God had chosen not just people, but a nation like England to be his prize. So Parliament is obviously beholden to its hero, Oliver Cromwell, who becomes the leading figure in the English Parliament during the 1650s. And he also, like Charles I, becomes really, really upset with how bureaucratic everything is, and he doesn't think anything is getting done. So in 1653, he actually dismisses Parliament, believe it or not, and he assigns himself as the Lord Protector. He can do this because he has the military backing, which military backing always means power in history, and he also has the political backing, and he is popular enough to do this. So he's kind of going against the grain of what they wanted to do originally by getting rid of Charles I. But this is kind of a contradiction. It seems that he is seizing some sort of executive power for himself, and he's almost becoming like a U.S. president. At least you could compare him to that, and he's going to serve in that position for the next 5 years. In addition to growing England's holdings on the Atlantic seaboard and also punishing the colonists because a lot of them sided with the king, Cromwell's biggest accomplishment when he is the Lord Protector is taking Ireland in 1655 and 1656. Basically, Ireland had sworn loyalty and fealty to England for centuries. The medieval monarchs had done their best to basically try to put Ireland under their foot. Both England and Scotland had planted, under James I and then Charles, had planted farms and projects to increase their influence and power and prestige in Ireland and to control more and more of the products and goods of Ireland. At this point, Ireland is not a huge potato manufacturer. That will come later because potatoes are brought to Ireland from the New World where they're actually in poisonous soil. The Irish soil is actually premium for growing potatoes. So potatoes, a huge part of Irish culture, identity, and food, because food is part of a culture and an identity of a nation, don't actually show up to Ireland until later in the 1600s, around the time of Cromwell. So, and that's actually the perfect place to grow them. Also, Russia. So, anyways, what else was I going to say? Moving forward. So England and Scotland had built these farms and had tried to exert as much control as they possibly could over the Irish, and it had been a slow process. The Irish had continually resisted English influence until Henry VIII in the 1500s, the father of Elizabeth, by the way, had determined that he was the Lord of Ireland and had added that to the titles of the King of England. So for a long time, the King of England, the British monarch, was known as the King of England, the King of Scotland, the Lord of Ireland, the King of France, based off of claims because the English owned land in France in the Middle Ages, and the Defensor Fidei, the defender of the faith. And Empress of India was added under Victoria, so the British monarch was known as the Emperor or Empress of India until India got its independence in the 1950s. And they are still known, I think, as the Lord of Ireland because Northern Ireland, of course, with Belfast, which is mainly Protestant, still belongs to the United Kingdom to this day, whereas Southern Ireland, which is mainly Catholic, got its independence in 1922. So, anyways, So for centuries, the English had tried to conquer Ireland or at least keep them from rebelling, and they had not been successful. And the building of farms and the increasing of land and taking more and more land from the Irish and giving it to the English had continually upset and frustrated the Irish, who remained extremely resilient in the face of such oppression and imperialism. And it was Cromwell who actually, using the new model army and his military tactics that had won him the Civil War, invaded Ireland during a rebellion and used that as a pretext to conquer all of the island. And Cromwell did this through bloodthirsty execution and ruthless attacks. His campaigns were brutal. He would oftentimes kill everyone he could possibly find, including women and children. In one famous incident, a tower was under siege, and Cromwell was asked by his general, there are Christians in there, there are men and women, there are women and children in there, what should we do with the tower? And Cromwell said, we should burn it. And his aide-de-camp asked him, why would you do something like this? And he said, well, God knows who are his. God knows who he has chosen, because remember, part of the Calvinist theology that Cromwell and many of the Puritans and parliamentarians have subscribed to is this idea of God picks who he wants to save. And he has picked a certain person to be saved, and therefore that person will be saved no matter what. So if they burn to death in a fire, it doesn't matter, because at least they get to go to heaven, right? Yeah, it's pretty brutal. So that harsh idea basically leads to those harsh ideas basically lead to the subjugation and basically a boot pressing on the face of the Irish for the foreseeable future. And so Ireland is finally integrated and captured by the English in the 1650s under Cromwell. In 1658, Cromwell dies, and he's the Lord Protector. He's not the monarch. He's not supposed to be the monarch. However, he has amassed a huge amount of power for himself. He has also dismissed Parliament, and he decides that his son, which is like a hierarchy, like a monarchy, will take over after him, his son Richard. Richard is not nearly as cunning or charismatic or powerful as his father. He's seen as pretty weak. And basically, Parliament is really struggling with this idea of having a new dynasty, the Cromwellian dynasty, take over England. So Parliament comes to the consensus that really it's no different having a Lord Protector than it is to have a king. And we could have Richard, who's totally incompetent, or we could try out Charles' son, Charles II, who is living in France at the time. And so in 1660, Richard is removed from power, and Charles is invited back to England, and he is going to take over and become the English monarch. in 1660. And this ends what's called the interregnum. It is the 11 years following the English Civil War of 1642 to 1649. It is the 11 years of 1649 to 1660 when England is run by Parliament, and more specifically Oliver Cromwell. It is a gap in more than 1,000 years of English monarchs that continues to this day, albeit the fact in the last 200 years they've basically become figureheads who do nothing except look very good and have a public image. So there's more to say here. After the Cromwells are gone, Charles II, the story isn't over, by the way. The struggle between Parliament and the kings who believe God has given them the right to rule will continue for another 30 years. Charles II rules for 25 years, and he's able to deal a little bit more cleanly with Parliament than his father, but he's constantly bickering with them as well, just not as bad. But no one wants another civil war, no one wants another revolution, so everybody kind of just shuts up and puts up with each other. Charles oversees England take the first pirates like Captain Morgan, which the rum is named after, who takes over Jamaica. That's why Jamaicans speak English more than the rest of the Caribbean. He oversees a series of charters for a new colony, Carolina, North and South Carolina. So Charles actually has a pretty steadfast reign, and of course his biggest, despite all of his military desires and his imperial desires, his biggest challenge is rebuilding London after the Great Fire of 1665. So he spends a huge amount of his reign doing that. And the issue of his succession also is a huge one that really, really concerns Parliament, because Parliament, still strongly Puritan, strongly Calvinist, does not want a Catholic monarch. Charles is a Protestant, but like his father, he really doesn't care. And at his deathbed, he actually embraces Catholicism. His wife is Catholic. He has mistresses. He has illegitimate children. He doesn't have a proper heir to actually succeed to the throne. So all eyes turn to his brother, James. And James is a Catholic, and that's the real concern in the early 1680s as Charles' health declines. He doesn't have a proper heir to succeed him, so it looks like his brother is going to take over, and his brother is a Catholic, and this really, really concerns Parliament. So Charles, at his deathbed, actually embraces the Catholic faith. He doesn't have a legitimate heir. And by the way, at this time in history, it wasn't that he was impotent or that he didn't have a wife. If you had a lover or a concubine or a mistress and you had a child with her, they weren't legitimate and couldn't take the throne. Also, it was very common for children to die in childbirth, even of the extremely wealthy or powerful, because you didn't have the proper sanitation that was needed to actually deliver babies properly and keep them healthy and safe. So because of that, infant mortality was extremely high. Maternal mortality was higher than it is now, but still about the same as it is now. And so infant mortality has become a huge sociological way people determine how modernized and how good the technology and health standards are of a particular country. If you have a low infant mortality rate compared to the rest of the world, you must be a modern and advanced and developed country. And it also increases your birth rates and increases your chances of living longer. If you have high infant mortality rates compared to other countries, you are backwards. And everybody was backwards by these standards. Even monarchs had their children die in infancy all the time. So it's not that he never had an heir, it's that his heirs never lived long enough. So in 1685, at his deathbed, he becomes Catholic, which really doesn't mean anything, and then he dies, and Parliament turns their eyes to his brother, who they're very worried about because he is a Catholic. And the real question is, how Catholic is he? Is he like a Mary I, who will try to bring England back to Catholicism? He's unabashedly Catholic. He is very open to the idea of restoring the papacy as the supreme head of the Church of England, when Henry VIII, 150 years ago, had declared that the monarch was the head of the Church of England and remains so to this day. So obviously James II is not going to be able to win. But James II, the brother of Charles II, is going to continue to wrestle with Parliament for another few years. And basically this tipping balance that has gone back and forth for the last 85 years over the last 4 monarchs and has led to a civil war where tens of thousands of Englishmen died, and an 11-year period of a break between England not having a monarch, while Scotland is also under pressure not to have a monarch. It's kind of strange how Scotland does it. But basically, there's a huge challenge between Parliament and the King that has continued for a long time and continues to this point, and basically you don't know what's going to happen next. So James II does the unthinkable in 1688. Then this really sends Parliament into a tizzy. His wife gives birth to a son and baptizes the son. I know, a child being born, a healthy child being born, and being baptized Catholic. Travesty. It's happened billions of times, but absolute travesty here. The problem is that this means that the heir to the throne is not his daughter Mary, who from his first marriage, who is a Protestant. It is now this boy, I think, named Charles. And so the question is, who will rule over England? Will a new Catholic dynasty be established, which gives all the more reason for England to become Catholic? Or will you have the rise of, or will you have some sort of back to Protestantism? And this is where where Parliament becomes extremely duplicitous and underhanded to get rid of James. They already hate him. He already hates them. It's not much of a competition at this point. So they go to Mary, who is living in the Netherlands with her husband, Prince William of Orange. And they convince William and Mary, which is an American college is named after them in the colony of Maryland, or Virginia, sorry, which is built on their honor, to come to England and overthrow James in 1689. In 1688 to 1689. This leads to what's known as the Glorious Revolution, or the Bloodless Revolution, because James raises an army and is about to fight, but basically loses his nerve and decides to abdicate, knowing that Parliament, most of the country is Protestant, Parliament is all Protestant, and they have all aligned with Mary, and he knows he doesn't want another civil war. He obviously grew up in the shadow of that civil war, just like his older brother Charles, so he graciously bows out and goes to France. That doesn't stop him, or his son, or his grandson, from trying to overthrow the English monarchs for the next 70 years. There's going to be a power struggle between between Mary's line, her and her husband and her sister, and the later line of the Hanover dynasty with James's descendants for 70 years, well into the middle of the 18th century. So James is exiled. His son will continue to claim the throne, be one of the greatest pretenders in English history. A pretender is somebody who who says they want the throne, but they really have no reason to take it. And Mary and William establish England firmly as Protestant, and basically they allow Parliament to do whatever Parliament wants to do. This leads to the creation of the 1689 English Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and it makes England a constitutional monarchy where the king does not have supreme power anymore, and not only supreme power, but they are limited, and they are basically at the behest of Parliament. And this is going to continue to be incurred upon by Parliament over the next century and a half to basically formally make the British nation a figurehead status. So by the time you get to Queen Victoria, England is totally, its politics and its policy are totally determined by Parliament, and the king or queen has basically become a figurehead. However, they represent the nation to the rest of the world, so that's still significant. So basically, that is the end of at least part of the end of the struggle between Parliament and the monarchs, because Mary II and William III, her husband, let Parliament do what they want for the rest of their lives. After they die, Mary dies in 1694 and William in 1702, they are succeeded by Mary's sister Anne, who has a bunch of children but no heirs of her own. And Anne in 1707 will oversee the Act of Union, where England and Scotland are brought into one union, and she will die, and her distant cousin will become King George I. So I'm not going to keep going from there. Anne dies in 1714. That's where we get the name Queen Anne, or Queen Anne style for like houses or things like that. So the interesting thing, the reason I bring that up, is because the British lineage to the throne, which was just the requirements for someone to inherit the throne, were established with 1689 that it cannot be a Catholic, and they recently just changed that. But basically, it prohibited Catholics from ever ruling over England again, and so England not only becomes firmly Protestant, but the issue between king and Parliament is finally solved, with Parliament gaining the upper hand and the monarchs basically just sitting on a huge wad of cash, prestige, and power, and being able to use that as their leverage, even though they don't have any political power anymore. And Anne had 17 children with her husband, George of Denmark, that's right, but wasn't able to actually have an heir. So eventually her distant cousin is going to take over because, like I mentioned, high infant mortality rates, or children dying at young ages because they catch diseases. So I am drinking coffee. Anyways. But yes, that is the first half. That is the history. So that is the history of what's called the Stuart dynasty, and that encompasses the huge issue of Parliament versus the king, and eventually Parliament wins the arm wrestle, and the Civil War in interregnum is the first step towards that, and it is a interesting chapter in English history because a lot of people don't think about England in that way. It is not the first English Civil War. You could say it's not the last one if you count the American Revolution, but it is the last one. So it's coffee. I do love tea, but this is coffee. Cold coffee, get myself going, give myself the energy to keep going through the live stream. So Anyways, if you liked what you learned about the history of the Stuart dynasty, the English Civil War, the interregnum period, and how England firmly became Catholic and Protestant, how Catholics were cut out of the succession line, how the Protestant Reformation in England basically ended with Protestants winning, and how the political struggle in England basically ended with Parliament winning and the king becoming a figurehead, you've just heard all about it here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. So hopefully, you like and subscribe. And yes, you can obsess over my beverage, but hopefully you're learning something as well. And now we're going to turn to our second topic of the day, which is obviously the life and legacy of the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who I will be doing a longer form video on later today, and who obviously shares the inauguration. Everyone's paying attention to the inauguration, but let's remember the life and legacy of the great Martin Luther King. I don't know if Trump referenced him in his speech, and I thought he should have, so if he didn't, that's not good. Thank you. I really appreciate the liking and subscribing. And yep, show some love to Rodolfo, who's holding down the chat really well, my wonderful moderator. Yes, the teeth gap. We all know I have a gap. That's amazing. And much love from the UK. Michael, I hope you enjoyed the history of your island, or one of your islands at least. So Martin Luther King Jr. is obviously probably one of the most important historical figures in U.S. history, maybe even in world history. And obviously you can't open up a history book or a textbook or something like that about history without maybe seeing his picture on the front. He's obviously inspired a huge amount of praise and inspired a huge amount of change through very peaceful means. And obviously he died in a horrible and shocking way that has stunned the nation, where there's a lot of mystery and questioning around that as well. So, Martin Luther King Jr. was, I'm going to talk a little bit about his life, his legacy, his ideas, and of course I'll mention a little bit about his death, because that actually has a little bit to do with the inauguration today. So, Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan made MLK Day a national holiday and chose the third Monday in January as close to King's birthday as possible. So that is why it has always been the third Monday in January, when it is celebrated around between the 15th to the 22nd or something like that. So, the point being, Martin Luther King was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., obviously he has the name Martin Luther based off of Protestant reformer Martin Luther, but Martin Luther King Sr. was a civil rights activist in his own right, although the civil rights movement did not have as much traction and wherewithal as it in the early 20th century. It was less organized than it became in the later part, in the middle of the 20th century, but it was obviously a force for good and for change that had predominated throughout the early part of the 1900s, the Republican Party. Republican presidents, ever since Abraham Lincoln, had more or less tried to enact civil rights for African Americans up till the time of Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 1900s. So the Presidents McKinley and Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford Hayes, had done what they could, but they had been fighting a wall of political blockade from Democrats and also from the Confederates, who had retaken control of the South, the old Democrats, keeping the South segregated, keeping African Americans from owning land, from being able to vote, from creating generational wealth, and from basically keeping them from being able to access proper education, proper housing and infrastructure. And this happened not just in the South, but across the entire United States. A city that we've heard about in the news recently, Pasadena, California, had redlining in its districts. And this was common in many cities where African Americans were excluded from owning in certain neighborhoods, and they could only purchase homes in other neighborhoods, and they couldn't get bank loans. And this continued well into the 1900s. And it is something that Dr. King fought against as well. The lack of proper infrastructure led many African Americans to be forced to live in the inner cities, and led to issues therein that Dr. King addressed during his life as well. Also, interestingly enough, at the time of Martin Luther King's birth, there was although he lived in the South, many African Americans had moved from the South to the North and were living in the cities like Chicago and Baltimore and Detroit and Philadelphia. These cities didn't have many or hardly any slaves at all during their time, and yet they became strongholds for African Americans, New York as well, because blacks from the South moved north to find economic and social opportunities during the 1910s, and especially during the Roaring 20s, when neighborhoods like Harlem and New York became extraordinarily popular. At the same time, Martin Luther King, it's not supposed to be warm. I drink it cold, by the way. I'll take a sip, though. Thank you. I should take a breath. anyways, I've been relocating and going through a lot, so I don't have a working microwave right now, so most of my coffee gets cold. Anyways, so MLK, getting back to it, was his father saw this, but his father was the pastor at a local church and a civil rights leader who used not just biblical stories and ideas, but also popular growing theologies of social justice and reparation to promote the idea that African Americans needed a place at the table. They needed full integration, they needed the end of segregation, and they needed economic and educational opportunities that they had been lacking. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, had already been created by one of the earliest civil rights leaders, W.E.B. Du Bois, in the 1890s, I believe. And W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and others had fought for African American civil rights. But civil rights have been put on the back burner, and basically the South was accepted as the South, and Jim Crow laws spread throughout the entire country. In fact, the first Jim Crow laws were actually in Oregon, of all places. But generally, so basically, the South was the worst of it. It not only had the Jim Crow laws, but it had structural and systemic racism that was completely unmitigated. There were no forces challenging it. The Dixiecrats, as they were known, Southern Democrats who were conservative in the fact that they wanted to maintain segregation based on racist ideas of African Americans that had carried over from the Civil War. Remember, even though they had freed the slaves, they still believed that they were inferior, and the only reason that you can keep a slave or believe it or segregate against somebody and discriminate against them was because you felt that they were worth it. You felt that they were unhuman, or they were subhuman, or they were beneath the full status of a human being. You can't really fully acknowledge someone's humanity, enslave, dehumanize, or discriminate against them. You have to dehumanize them in some way, shape, or form, and that is what had happened to African Americans for centuries in America. So, and Martin Luther King obviously experienced this firsthand in his own life, struggling with all sorts of issues when it came to segregation. Now, King, like his father, became educated in African American homiletics, which is preaching, the style of preaching. I'm trying to remember exactly where he went to seminary to become a minister. Was it Union? I think it was Union Theological Seminary in Chicago. So King went all over the country and experienced racism and segregation in different ways and shapes and forms, and he saw it in different ways and shapes and forms, and he saw it in the inner cities of places like Chicago and Detroit and New York, but he also saw it, obviously, in its most irascible and nasty form in his own land of Georgia and the rest of the South, especially the Deep South. So, anyways, so the truth of the matter, so King became involved in learning about social justice and theories related to reparation and integration in his seminary teachings. He became associated with people who believed in economic redistribution of wealth, in social justice, and things like this, and he became associated with some people who had communist leanings, who were later investigated by the FBI, and this is going to set up a line of investigation from the Federal Bureau of Investigation into King for the rest of his life, thanks to none other than J. Edgar Hoover, the man who basically built the FBI brick by brick into being a watchdog for traditional values and conservatism in the United States. So King was targeted by the FBI throughout most of his life, and investigated, with many people believing that he was actually a communist. King never espoused communism and actually distanced himself from communism. And the reason this was such a big issue is that the time when King was coming up in circles of the civil rights movement and also in preaching in the 40s and the 50s, when he was getting this education, he was obviously dealing with the issue that the rest of the world was, there was the Cold War. There was this struggle between the West and the Soviet Union, and obviously anyone who was a communist was considered a national security threat and a danger, and was usually deplatformed by the American government. The House Un-American Activities community was very good at doing this, and a lot of questions surrounded and a lot of shadow surrounded anyone who fought actively and vocally for civil rights for African Americans, which was a way to appease Southern conservatives who basically hated communism but also hated the idea of blacks getting free, full integration and civil rights. So the truth of the matter is that as this happened, MLK became a target for investigation by the government and was often questioned whether or not he was a Marxist. So At the same time, speaking of his personal life, as some of you are doing in the chat, Martin Luther King fell in love and got married to Coretta Scott King. Now, Martin Luther King is an amazing man who did a lot of great things, but he was not perfect. He is notorious for his many numerous affairs on Coretta Scott King and for his own dalliances there. Now, I do not look at Martin Luther King as a symbol of a great man because of what he did when it comes to how he treated women. I look at him as a symbol of a great man because of what he did for his people and for justice and civil rights. So the truth of the matter is that Martin Luther King was definitely not a perfect saint in the way that you would describe, especially for a preacher, and that obviously carries a weight to it. This was later exacerbated, and when they found out, the FBI really got on it as a way to delegitimize King, because 60 years ago, when you had an affair with women, the FBI tapes of King describe and actually talk about these affairs, with King talking about his dalliances and romances. That's obviously has huge moral weight in an extremely Christian country and would be a way for people to turn and shun Dr. King. But they could never fully or successfully deplatform him, despite the fact that King was far from perfect. King was committed to full integration and civil rights for African Americans. When King was at Union, I believe it was Union, he learned about Mohandas Gandhi, the Indian leader who had helped India gain independence through civil disobedience, which was the disobeying of laws through nonviolent means. During the 1910s and 20s, after World War I especially, the Indians had worked hard to gain their independence from Great Britain. But what they had struggled with was the fact that they were often fighting with the British in the streets, and Gandhi came to the realization as he led the Indian National Congress, the independence movement in India, that Indians could not gain their independence by being violent and accusatory, that they actually would only gain free independence and full integration into society and be able to live on their own through civil disobedience. So that involved public demonstrations, protests, peaceful chants and marches. It involved boycotting goods that they didn't want to buy from the British. It also involved Gandhi, a devout Hindu, going on hunger strikes and refusing to eating, using his religious beliefs as a way to protest injustice. And King picked up on these ideas and brought them back to the South with him. He also became the pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church he also became a pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in the 1950s, leading there with his wife, succeeding his father, and preaching with excellent rhetoric and an amazing speaking ability about the ideas of full integration. He became extremely involved in the NAACP and in the civil rights movement. And his first major opportunity to become a leader in that movement happened in 1955, and it wasn't because of him. A woman named Rosa Parks who was part of the civil rights movement, although nobody thought that at the time, violated the rules in I believe it was Selma, Alabama. No, was it Montgomery? I'm trying to remember which city it was. It was in Alabama. She violated the segregation law. The segregation law said that African Americans had to sit at the back of the bus if there wasn't space available for a white customer. So in 1895, the the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a decision called Plessy versus Ferguson, which had basically allowed segregation. And the way segregation worked was it was supposed to be separate facilities or separate spaces for African Americans and whites, but they were supposed to be equal. They were supposed to be of the same quality. They were never of the same quality. Obviously, sitting at the back of the bus is more inconvenient than sitting at the front of the bus. If you like to sit at the back of the bus, no offense to you, but it's more inconvenient and easier, especially back then, to get off the bus sitting in the back than sitting in the front. So this was another way that African Americans were inconvenienced. Parks had had a long day at work and did not want to be inconvenienced by such an occasion, so she decided to stay in her seat. She was eventually arrested for this. It was Selma, Alabama. She was eventually arrested for this and brought to jail, and her mugshot's obviously very famous. This very nice woman who doesn't look like she's a threat to anyone being arrested just because she wouldn't give up her seat to a white passenger. And that obviously caused a huge amount of anger. At the same time, Emmett Till, a young African-American boy, was found lynched and murdered and mutilated for simply trying to flirt with a white woman. These sorts of injustices perpetrated and gained more traction for the civil rights movement, which had been gaining traction since the late 1940s under the leadership of a man named A. Philip Randolph. At the same time, also in 55, Brown versus the Board of Education happened, which desegregated American schools. So there was a lot of activity and a lot of movement happened. There was a lot of litigation happening. And the main legal force, by the way, for civil rights is a man named Thurgood Marshall, who will be the first black Supreme Court justice in the 1960s. But this is an opportunity. But King organizes the bus boycotts. Basically, African Americans would not ride the buses in Selma. And he goes to Alabama and becomes a leader in the civil rights movement and organizes these protests that become extraordinarily popular over the next few months and gains a lot of tractions and eventually gets the law repealed. So King is single-handedly building his brand because he is so active and well-spoken when it comes to civil rights, and he's slowly but surely gaining a sense of leadership because of his fiery speeches and his ability to unify people and his message of peace, not violence. Many African Americans have been tempted by the idea of using violence as a means to get what they had wanted. King did never believe that. He always believed that violence was not the answer. He understood why people had resulted to violence or resorted to violence in certain things, but he never believed that violence would solve the day. He kept his head level throughout the difficult situations, which is what a true leader does. And that was how he was able to gain more rights and more integration for his people. He became a great person who changed history, not because he was active and angry and aggressive, but because he was calm, humble, and patient. This obviously is on best display when he was arrested in 1956 and in Birmingham, and wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he said it was completely morally right for African Americans to ignore unjust rules like the ones that segregation had imposed. This included obviously using separate facilities that weren't as good, having to be in different parts of a train or in a bus. This involved using separate bathrooms. This involved separate areas of restaurants. These were all government-mandated discrimination and racism because all of the facilities that African Americans used, by and large, were inferior to those whites used. This involved using separate schools. This involved using separate textbooks. This involved all these sorts of things that were really, really awful. And so King was actually pretty effective at doing this, and his letter to the Birmingham jail became famous, and it put him on the national map. King continued to lead African Americans through nonviolence to protests and marches, boycotts, and all sorts of things to disturb the society as much as possible without causing a drop of blood. Interestingly enough, at the same time, he developed his own organization, the Southern Negro Christian Coalition, which was a group of African American civil rights leaders who did everything in their power to protest using civil disobedience as their means to an end. King ran into opposition from other African American leaders like in the years to come, such as Malcolm X and later on men like Stokely Carmichael, who basically believed that using civil disobedience was an ineffective way of getting what you wanted, and that violence would actually aggressive resistance to the society would actually get the attention. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. So violence was actually the solution to the problem, not part of the problem. So King never believed that and kept a level head throughout all the years. And by and large, despite not being as intellectual as King or as intellectual as Malcolm X or being as aggressive and assertive as the Black Panthers and Stokely Carmichael and these people, he still managed to get an extreme amount done. So what happens next? Well, King believes that that civil rights is headed in the right direction, and there are signs to indicate this. Dwight Eisenhower, the U.S. president, has been very amenable to civil rights. There are civil rights bills that have passed Congress several times or have failed to pass through Congress to get to the president's desk so he can sign it. And then a new young president, John F. Kennedy, emerges, and Kennedy, who had relied on the Southern Democratic vote to be able to become president, is hesitant to grant full integration in civil rights, but he is entranced by the idea of providing more and more civil rights. Integration of schools continues to be an issue in places like Little Rock and also in Alabama, which leads to more boycotts from King. So in some cases, the National Guard has to be called in, like they were at Little Rock in 1957, and in 1963, Alabama's governor, George Wallace, refuses to assert any sort of integration for African Americans, declaring that there would be segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. This and the persecution of African Americans involved in the civil rights movement continues to perpetrate all sorts of national attention and makes people more and more amenable to King's case as they see the vitriol and hatred that doesn't seem to be justifiable by Southern whites. So, King's platform is growing, his influence is growing, and basically the Kennedy administration is interested in working with him, but they don't know exactly how to proceed because they are in a politically sensitive position. But Kennedy has a slower approach to civil rights, and this leads to many African Americans, like Malcolm X, calling for more aggressive action. At the same time, the death of Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader in the South in 1963, who was also murdered by Southern racists, infuriates King and the African American community, and this, along with everything else going on, leads King at the height of his power to basically say that he can devise a huge meeting of different African American civil rights movements and have a march. And the march is to the Washington Mall in August 28th of 1963. And they walk all the way through Washington, D.C., all the way to the Lincoln. Sorry about that. My light went out. Okay, they march all the way to Washington, D.C., they march all the way through Washington, D.C., all the way to the Lincoln Monument. And my light went off again. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's see if this stays on. If not, the lighting's not too bad. Oh well. Anyways, it happens. So they march all the way from, I believe it's the White House, all the way to the Washington Mall, and in front of the Lincoln Memorial, a bunch of different civil rights leaders speak, including Congressman John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph. I don't believe Malcolm X was there. But Martin Luther King speaks, and he's obviously the keynote speaker. He has gained a reputation for being the best speaker and for having the most popular method of advocating for civil rights. It's not the only one, but it's the most popular one. And with thousands of people watching and the entire world watching, with the United States claiming that the Soviet Union, in the midst of the Cold War, has oppressed has oppressed its people and restricted their rights, King calls out the United States for not living up to its own ideas and for oppressing and restricting the rights of African Americans. He also calls for, probably the most famous lines in American history, that people will be judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. And of course, he starts with his famous line, "I have a dream." The "I have a dream" speech might be one of the best, if not the best, speeches delivered in American history. It is extraordinarily moving. It is passionate. It invokes the ideals of Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington, and basically calls on America to be held accountable for its own philosophy. The ideals that America was supposedly started on, they need to be paid forward to African Americans who have been disenfranchised on them ever since they were created nearly 2 centuries before this. So, the truth of the matter is, this is an extremely persuasive method of speaking. King has great rhetoric. He has proven himself to be the best speaker in the civil rights movement with the most popular method in the civil rights movement. So obviously he is the keynote speaker, and he is the one going to Kennedy and becoming the point person on all of the civil rights legislation. Of course, there are others who are working with him, some who believe that King is too tepid, others who believe King is too radical. And once again, many people question King's actual political loyalties. It has never been thoroughly declared whether King was a Democrat or a Republican, and a lot of people were worried that he was a communist. And this was a worry, once again, shared by the FBI, who did everything in their power to investigate and defrock King and basically discredit him to the American people. That never actually came fully to fruition. Meanwhile, of course, through all of this, King's dalliances and romantic entanglements continue and put a huge strain on his marriage. King is kind of in this cycle of apologizing to his wife and saying that he won't do it again, and then kind of going back, to returning to the debauchery. I can't finish the analogy. We're kind of going in a cycle that doesn't really work very well and isn't helping his marriage. but his efforts are helping to change the American landscape as more and more people become open to the ideas of interracial marriage. More and more people become open to the ideas of integration. More and more people become open to the ideas of full civil rights for African Americans. And basically, with the civil rights movement gaining traction, not just among African Americans, but among whites and among celebrities throughout all of Hollywood, and with many politicians advocating it, it seems that the next Civil Rights Act might be the one that passes both chambers of Congress and finally makes it to Kennedy's desk, and Kennedy will be able to sign it. Except that and that happens in 1964, except that it's not Kennedy. In November, Kennedy is assassinated in one of the most controversial deaths in American history in Dallas, and he is succeeded by his vice president, also a Texan, Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson was a Southerner. He had voted against previous civil rights legislation, and he had been known as basically a Southern Democrat. And a lot of people worried that he would roll back the clock on civil rights. However, in continuing the spirit of John F. Kennedy, Johnson, probably for political gain, but perhaps also out of conviction, became an advocate of civil rights and worked tirelessly to establish a new system that would not only grant full integration to African Americans, but would give them opportunities for educational and economic advancement that they hadn't done before, as well as for all poor people who struggled with poverty. This is the makings of what Johnson called his Great Society, a welfare state that created a social safety net for health insurance, food supplies, educational access, and of course, civil rights for minorities, especially Black Americans. So in 1964, surprising many people, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, and this basically gets rid of all segregation in all places, meaning that that no one can create a white or colored space in a restaurant and say white people can only sit here and blacks can only sit there. Anyone can sit wherever they want in a restaurant. People are allowed to use the same facilities, and this is eventually applied, and it's already been applied to education. It continues to roll out in educational programs as African Americans all of a sudden have more educational opportunities, and also, of course, this also applies to this will eventually apply to personal lives, as Loving versus Virginia in 1966, the Supreme Court overturns bans on interracial marriage. So as time goes on, this is applied more and more. Obviously, one of the huge political blocks for African Americans have been poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses, which basically kept African Americans, especially poor ones, from voting. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act does away with any sort of restriction that prohibits someone from voting, and also basically desegregates the electoral process in America. These two pieces of legislation are some of King's greatest achievements. And as the 60s wears on, he turns his attention to social issues. The fight is not over. Racism and segregation persist. But also, the issues are far more systemic and social now than they had been before, where there was this obvious huge barrier that King had to get past. The big issue is now what happens. Continual discrimination, lack of economic opportunities. Damage has been done to the Black community, and it doesn't just get rectified because Lyndon Johnson signs a couple of bills. So the implementation and the continual implementation of new laws and new ideas that will continue to provide opportunities for African Americans becomes a dominant narrative and feature of King's work throughout the rest of the 1960s. As well, he turns his attention to something that is starting to divide the nation more and more after 1965, and that is the Vietnam War. King was originally very quiet about the Vietnam War, an advocate for a peace, perpetual peace, social justice, and what became known as liberation theology. King basically believes that any war is bad, but he also doesn't love communism. He understands why people embrace communism. He also understands why people embrace violence, but it doesn't mean that he advocates them necessarily. So, as he continues to deal with the issues facing African Americans, he sees that obviously many African Americans are fighting in Vietnam and many of them are dying along with white soldiers, and he doesn't believe that the war was started on its means or was a just war that would actually be that Christians could actually support. So eventually, as a pastor, King comes out against the Vietnam War. This really starts to turns more and more mainstream people away from King in 1967 and 1968. And King is continuing to work on, so that becomes part of King's platform to end the war in Vietnam, to bring peace to the world as much as possible. And he believes that if America is going to win the war against the communists, they have to do it by being just and fair and integrating people properly, and by focusing on healing the social ills faced by African Americans and the poor in the United States, rather than in trying to uphold a corrupt government in South Vietnam. So King becomes an outspoken critic of the war in Vietnam and becomes more and more so, and also is dealing with the continual division as more and more blacks seeing not enough changing quick enough, become entranced with the idea of more aggressive means of fighting for civil rights, such as the Black Panthers. King is distressed by this, but continues plugging along, doing the same thing he has done for 15 years now that has seemingly worked effectively. This brings him to Memphis, Tennessee in April of 1968 for a strike of, I believe it's coal workers or iron workers, many of whom are African American, many of whom are being underpaid. And King, working on obviously making a collective bargaining agreement, but also working on the rights for workers, which is a huge part of, especially for people who are in the working class, people who are in the middle class and things like that, the working class who are working in dirty jobs, basically blue collar people. They are really struggling, and many of them are African Americans, and they are disproportionately affected. So obviously, one of the big, basically the issue, these people are struggling to basically make ends meet, and King believes they need better rights, they need better collective agreements, they need better wages, and all of these things. And so he goes to a church and he speaks the famous from the Mount, I have been to the mountaintop speech, where he basically, in a strange way, talks about that he has seen, he compares himself to the prophet Moses, that he has achieved much in his life. And the man is only 39, by the way. He has achieved much in his life, and much has been accomplished. However, much remains. He has seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, as he says at the end of the speech, and he doesn't know what's going to happen next. And he doesn't know if he's going to get all the way, he doesn't know if he's going to get there with you, is his famous phrase. It seems almost prophetic in the same way that Lincoln supposedly had dreams about his own death. The King would say this. It's a very dark and ironic moment in King's life where he says, I may not get all the way with you. I may not get to the very end of the road. I may not achieve all the rest of what I am hoping to achieve. Workers' rights, peace in the world, social justice, all of these things. But I'm going to keep going as much as I can, as long as I have what I want. As long as I can have strength in my bones, I'm going to continue to do what I have always done for your benefit and for the benefit of the whole world. And he also has the famous line, he wants to live a long life. Longevity is important, but getting done what God has given him, this mission that he believes God has given him to do, matters even more to him. And that's interesting. The next day, before he goes to any of these meetings, trying to negotiate on behalf of these workers, King is shot and killed in his hotel room by James Earl Ray. The man next to King who watches him get shot is, of course, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who becomes one of the leaders of the civil rights movement afterwards. But King is assassinated on April 4th, 1968, at 39 years of age. This causes a huge crisis in America. There are riots everywhere. There is upheaval everywhere. There is a new Civil Rights Act for housing, to end discrimination in housing, that is passed quickly in 1968. Violence erupts on the streets, and basically the more violent wings of the civil rights movement, ironically, in anger over King's death, vandalize and basically ignore all of his moral warnings and stances. They disregard civil disobedience to try to lament the legacy of a man who preached only civil disobedience. And so it is really, really, it is quite a sad and terrible moment in American history. And King obviously is buried, and his legacy is lived on by the activity of his wife, who becomes a leading civil rights activist. Every civil rights leader therein, the NAACP, the Rainbow Coalition, are doing everything in their power, have done everything in their power to continue his life and legacy. His son and niece also work on civil rights for different affected areas of the black community. And obviously, this man has become one of the most important people in American history. In the 1970s, President Gerald Ford calls for a day of celebration for Martin Luther King, his life and legacy, and for everything he worked for. And of course, like I mentioned before, in 1986, following legislation signed by President Reagan, Martin Luther King Day becomes a national holiday. So if you have a day off, or if the kids have a day off from school or something like that, now you know why. It's because of that life and that legacy. Now, how is that connected at all to today's presidential inauguration, like I mentioned at the beginning? Well, two reasons. One, they happen to fall on the same day this year, which is kind of interesting, but also at the same time, something that might be a little less coincidental is what President Trump, there is obviously an FBI investigation. Again, the guys who were investigating King investigated the assassination of King. So James Earl Ray is the guy who everyone says killed King. We don't know. Now, it's a far more believable story than Lee Harvey Oswald. It's far more probable. There's far less conspiracy surrounding it. But a lot of people have wondered, who was James Earl Ray? Who was he really working for? And was the FBI behind the assassination of King, just like they might have been behind the assassination of Kennedy? Nobody exactly knows. People believe that the government, the conservative factions of the military-industrial complex and the deep state and the intelligence community in the United States worried about King keeping people from going to fight for war in Vietnam, and worried about more draft dodgers who were invoking King's name, particularly black people, would do everything in their power to keep the United States on course to fight in Vietnam. And when one of the biggest public figures and one of the most famous public figures in the United States has publicly declared his hatred, his desire for the war to end, and the idea that it is not a just war and it can only, and that the U.S. has to pull out of there, this is a PR nightmare for trying to convince African Americans to fight for their country in Vietnam. Because why should they fight for their country that's segregated and discriminated against them? And why should they fight in Vietnam, of all places? This is a potential nightmare for the government. And so a lot of people have theorized through the years that King was actually killed by the U.S. government in an attempt to quiet him up because he was speaking against the American system. He was saying he understood why people embraced communism and wanted to be communists. And of course, he was also speaking out against the war in Vietnam. So all of this really leads a lot of people to feel that King has lost his marbles, but it's also led a lot of people to feel through the years that the government had a reason for taking King out and either used James Earl Ray or he was a patsy for them, just like they think Oswald was a patsy for Kennedy. And so that the intelligence community, what has been dubbed the deep state, the National Security Agency or the FBI or CIA, could continue to promulgate its anti-communist agenda by getting rid of two of America's figures, Kennedy first and then King. So the assassination conspiracy theories or whatever you consider them are connected in some way, shape, or form, but there's a lot of people who wonder and question if MLK was killed by the U.S. government. Now, this connects to today because Donald Trump, who has declared himself an enemy of the deep state and believes the deep state was out to target him and take him down, and maybe even to kill him, has said that he will release the files to the public. He will declassify the MLK assassination files that were made in the investigation following King's death. This obviously raises a big question of what will we see next and what will we learn about King's death that we don't know already. That's a quick aside about his death, but I hope that you were able to learn something about his life and the meaning and the impact of that life because of his ability to speak, his ability to reason, his ability to remain moderate and apolitical and thoughtful and intelligent, and his ability to show love and care, and his ability to be patient, because this was a long battle against horrifying forms of discrimination that would make another man crumble. King was able to rally his people and his nation to change in a better way and become a better version of itself, to live up to those ideas of Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, and Lincoln. And that is what makes MLK such an incredible person in so many ways. And the world has changed dramatically because he existed. And who knows what he would have been able to accomplish if he had continued to live. In many ways, he has a similar legacy in that part to John F. Kennedy. So, anyways, I hope that you enjoyed me talking about two of the most interesting historical topics to me: the English Civil War and how the English became firmly Protestant, and how the king lost all of his power in England, and the interregnum period, and also about the life and legacy of the great Dr. Martin Luther King. I hope you all enjoy and have a wonderful Martin Luther King Day, by the way. I should have probably started out by that. But please, yes, it's my pleasure, Rodolfo. Absolutely a pleasure. Charisse, please like and subscribe. Join the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Becoming a Friendly Neighborhood Historian is as easy as liking and subscribing. And I will stay on for another few minutes to take any questions you have regarding the topics. If you need a point of clarification, if there was something I missed, I'm always willing to learn something. I'm always willing to grow with all of you. So please don't hesitate to ask me something about history or social studies, particularly about these topics, or leave a comment. But don't leave. But if you really enjoyed this, if you felt you learned something, like and subscribe. And if you disagree with my interpretation or the way I analyzed it, like and subscribe anyways, and come back and tell me why I'm wrong, because I'm willing to learn and grow, and I hope you are too. So thank you for all the support. I'm from the United States. I don't get into specifics of where I'm from, but people have been able to deduce more or less based off of me being forced to relocate recently. This has been a difficult time for me and my family. This is not my normal settings. This will be my normal settings for the foreseeable future, but it's not my normal settings now. So I have also, I have a lot of long and short form content. By the way, I'm doing stuff about the inauguration. I'm doing stuff about the history of the inauguration. I do daily history videos, who died on this day, who was born on this day. So if you want to learn history about what happened on this day or who was born on this day, or you want to learn different fast facts about history, historical myths, did you knows, stuff like that, please like and subscribe. I'm starting a series about Chinese imperial dynasties with the Shia dynasty tonight, so please check that out. I do long and short form videos that hopefully you'll enjoy. And if you want to hear me talk about Dr. King in a different context, I will be writing my Substack article, Friendly History Substack, about him, and I will also be doing a long form video on him tonight, so please check that out. But yes, I am from the US, to answer your question. I just want to do a plug for all the other stuff that I do here on the channel. So I will not be streaming tomorrow. I only stream on the weekends, but this is a 3-day weekend. I wanted to do 4 live streams in a row. I apologize if anyone was going to be here yesterday and I wasn't here. I'm sorry about all of that. Just the craziness of having to relocate and get everything situated again. So there's that. But yeah, let me see here. I'm going to go through the chat a little bit. How long is it? Well, my live streams are usually an hour. Thomas, LBJ's miserable legacy. Yeah, LBJ is not my favorite president, and I don't think he was that good of a human being. He did a lot of good in his presidency, but fighting a war with a huge domestic program and social safety net doesn't really work out. China is really interesting. I'm really fascinated about it. So there's a dynasty of Chinese imperial rulers called the Shia, which supposedly existed 2,000 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. And the Chinese believe that the Shia dynasty is real, and the West doesn't. But I have had Chinese students of mine in the past who are from China tell me it is real, it did happen, it is a part of their legacy, and even if it's mythology, sometimes the myth reveals more about the people than the actual history does. So I'm going to be doing a video on the Shia dynasty, and those are usually short 1-minute videos, so I've got a lot of that. I've done stuff on the inauguration. I'm going to do a video about why it's January 20th at noon, and what is the 20th Amendment that changed it. It used to be March 4th was when the president was signed in, but modern technology made it easier for presidents to get elected and for them to know congressional elections and presidential elections earlier so people could get sworn in sooner, and there wouldn't be such a long lame duck session where the president who's going out is replaced by the president coming in. Thank you, Thomas. Well, if you know, that's why I've got the Patreon, to pay for a nice mahogany wood study and a fireplace. And all you need is love. And Homer, all we need is you. And Homer has brought me so many laughs, so love you, Homer. Do you know much about William Marshall, the greatest knight that ever lived and served loyally for 3 kings? I've heard of him. I've heard that name before. I don't know about him in particular. Was he an Order of the Garter? What about my left eye? I am not leaving you. Hopefully you have not left me. I try not to talk too fast, but it's a struggle of mine. I am in a competition with Ben Shapiro to find out who can break the Guinness Book of World Records for words in a minute. But if you want me to slow down, I'm more than capable of slowing down. When I'm doing fast-paced, short-length videos, I tend to talk fast. When I do longer-form videos, I tend to slow down. So if you want to hear something quiet, and slow and peaceful, listen to my videos on the history of Christmas or the history of Hanukkah, where I tend to speak a little bit more slowly. And yes, it is to cover the material. There's a lot here. Why does the West not believe it? Well, I believe because scholars, there's not enough, because it's one of those things where it's like Gilgamesh. There's this mythical idea around it, and ancient histories often include a lot of mythological ideas and supernatural occurrences in them, and the whole idea of the mandate of heaven, which is huge to Chinese imperial understanding, which I should do a video on anyways, just to cover my bases, basically is this idea that if the ruler is good, then he has the mandate of heaven. If the ruler is bad, he has lost the mandate of heaven, or if anything bad should befall him, it's his fault, and that means the mandate of heaven is passing from him. And if he does anything good, or if good things happen to him, he still has the mandate of heaven. So I think it's because there's mythical ideas associated, there's mythological writing, and there's not a lot of archaeological evidence. That's why they don't typically believe in the Shia. The first giant dynasty, the Shan, is the ancient dynasty. The first really united dynasty that controlled all of what we know as China, really is the Qing dynasty, Qin, Qin dynasty. Qing is Qing. I'm confused, and I know that's confusing, but there is a dynasty called the Qing dynasty. Well, that's interesting. Hey, thank you for joining us, Prisha. Who are you? I am the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. If you like and subscribe, Muffin Man, you can become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. I talk about history, social studies, geopolitics, past and present, all that great stuff. It's 4 a.m. Wow, thank you for joining us at 4 a.m. Where are you? So now I look crazy. Interesting. William Marshall served 4 English monarchs, Henry II, Richard I, John, and Henry III. Check him out. Yes, I've heard about him. He was one of the, I think he held down the fort. He's basically the regent of the land while Richard was off crusading. Interesting. Oh, you're from India. Well, thank you for joining us from the land of the Mughal Empire. It's always great to have somebody from India. What's up? Thank you for joining us, the Gucci man. Thank you for joining the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. So, again, if you liked what you learned about, if you like learning about history, even if you don't agree with everything I've said, then you can consider liking and subscribing, helping the channel grow, getting the word out, and coming back and joining us for our live stream Q&As. We have ones where you can ask me anything about history at all, any type of history, any subject, any area, any time period, and I will do my best to give you as good of an answer as I can. That's usually Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and Saturdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard. And then Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is our usual live stream lecture. And I don't have a topic next week, so if anyone wants to recommend a topic for next week's live stream lecture, I'll be happy to do that. Gucci man, I appreciate your subscription. You're a real one. You got your shout out too. Michael St. John. Atlantis was supposed to be, the reason it's called the Atlantic Ocean is that's because they thought that's where Atlantis was originally. It's supposed to be past the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Straits of Gibraltar. At least that's what many of the ancients believed. You know, in classic history like the Roman Empire, yes, I have an entire series, or at least I have an entire set of videos that I need to put into a playlist. There's a series on all the Roman emperors. I've done the kings of England, the Roman emperors, the U.S. presidents. Go check that out. I want to do Flautists, the first ladies, and I want to do the French monarchs. But now the time is to do Chinese imperial dynasties. I'm really looking forward to it. So, Boys in the Tower. I don't know what that is. Oh, Richard. Oh, you mean Edward V and Richard of York? Yes. I've done several videos on the War of the Roses and Richard III, so go check those out. But yes, that's a really fascinating thing. And their ghosts supposedly haunted there for centuries to come. Basically, these two boys are locked in the tower. In 1485, King Edward IV dies of England, and he is supposed to be succeeded by his son Edward, who becomes Edward V. But in order to keep him and his younger brother Richard safe, their uncle, Richard III, who is later immortalized in the most gruesome way with a horrible hunchback by Shakespeare, which is how we know a lot about English kings, by the way, puts them in the Tower of London for safekeeping and probably starved them to death so that he could become the king. And then he is killed by Henry Tudor, who is the father of Henry VII and the grandfather of Elizabeth, who I started off this whole thing with. So there's your line there. But yes, the two boys in the tower, they found skeletal remains in the 1980s or the 17th, or was it the 1780s? 1780s, they found skeletal remains of two boys. So 3 centuries after they died. Favorite Roman emperor? I don't know about the best. Obviously, I think Augustus stands out as the best. The one that I think, I gotta love Trajan for just being just a Sigma Chad with all of his conquering. Do you know anything about the Sonke Marabout Wars? No, I don't. I'm gonna have to learn about that. I don't BS you here on the channel. If I don't know, I'm gonna say I don't know, and if I'm not sure, I'm gonna try to do my best to make a hypothetical, educated guess. But yeah. Third Crusade, 1189 would be cool. Yep, I did an entire series on the Crusades, Rugger. Go check it out. And I did one on Richard I too, which talks about the Crusades. Where did the Mayans go? That's what I want to know. I've talked about that. I think intermarriage, assimilation into other tribes, probably. Wow, you're from Shanghai. That's amazing, Pro DJ. Yep, I like China. I love China. China. Sorry, I just had to. It's inauguration day. Sue me. Yes, they found their bones under the stairs. Yep. Yeah, they don't know. They can't tell if it's DNA from boys in the 1480s, but it looks like 2 teenage or preteen boys who would be around the ages of Edward V and Richard of York. So, Trajan's column. I think you mean Hadrian's Wall is the wall in England. Augustus has by far the most. Yeah, and the longest ruling emperor of Rome. The first, best, and longest ruling. Do you know about the Susquehanna tribe? Very little info about them. A little bit. I'm assuming that's a native tribe, Susquehanna. Are they in Pennsylvania? I think when I hear Susquehanna, I think of Susquehanna University, which I think is in Pennsylvania. Yep. Well, actually, interestingly enough, that was right after the War of the Roses, Rodolfo, and that was the War of the Roses inspired Game of Thrones. So there you go. See, I did my best. I took a good guess, and I got it right. I did an entire series on the election, because I knew it was a historical election in 2024 here in the States, and I had to look at polls and stuff like that. And so Susquehanna would poll Pennsylvania, so I figured out Susquehanna was in Pennsylvania, and I figured out that's from there. I'm not in China. I'm not in China. I love China. I love its history. I love its culture. I love its society. I love its food. Chinese food is my favorite food. I'm in the United States. Did you steal your smoking jacket from Hugh Hefner himself? No, he gave it to me. I'm his illegitimate son. I mean, I kind of look like him, I guess. I don't know. History of Britain is crazy. 420, if you like the history of Great Britain, check out my series on the English monarchs. And it's so interesting. So I really love being around all of you and all your support and love. Yeah, the Trajan's column, which shows him taking over the temple and all the victories he had in Spain. Trajan basically got Rome to be bigger than ever, even took over Armenia. So, interestingly enough. Yes, of course, El Pepe, whenever. So, like, subscribe, join us on Substack. Check out my article there. I'll be doing, hopefully, 2 today. I'm doing a lot for the channel today. One about MLK and one I think about inauguration. They'll both be shorter, but and then of course there's the Patreon if you want to give and get some more exclusive content. I've got it there too. So thank you so much. I'm glad that you feel that. We feel that too. So liking, subscribing, putting us in the algorithms, getting all of that great stuff going is exactly what's going to get us there. So I really appreciate everybody who joined us and all the great questions and all the great participation. I mean, we always have trolls and stuff like that in the chat. I mean, I had a great guy who came in the other day and he said, I was here to troll you, but you won me over with your humor. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you, Cowboys and Kings. And I appreciate all of you out there on YouTube. Take care, and I hope you have a wonderful week. And I will see you at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday for our live Q&A. Yes, Japan's history is fighting Korea. Yes, it is. And I've talked a little bit about that, and I'm reading Shogun right now. So I'm learning a lot about Japan, and I love that stuff. I did a video on the Black Samurais. They were African samurais, actually. So thank you so much, El Pepe. You are a real one. Take care. I hope you have a great week. Learn about some history, and join me back on Friday evening for some Q&A. Ask me anything. Take care, and happy MLK Day. Have a good one.